All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started here, folks. Welcome. I'm going to read here from one of my earlier books, just a brief passage. This is called, excuse me, Always Being, Always Becoming. And it in many ways captures those words right there capture sort of the essence of what I would say is happening here. Something is always here, something is always being, something is always existing, and yet that which is here, call it whatever we call it, life, existence, reality, God, there's no word for it, is always here, and it's always becoming, apparently, always seeming to be something else, but never departing from its nature, from itself. Everything is in a state of becoming something else. Life is constantly on the move, forever turning itself into something new, something fresh, something it has never been before. But often we resist this movement, struggling to sustain what cannot be sustained and control what cannot be controlled. We seek safety and security in things we believe are permanent, our identities, our ideologies, our religious beliefs, and yet the energy of life is never fixed, but always changing. For what we call the moment, and every idea we ever held about it, is already gone, already dissolving into the next, in a never-ending cascade of creation and destruction. What appears is at the same time disappearing. The arising and the passing away, a single movement without beginning or end. This is the preciousness of life, this amazing constellation of feelings, thoughts, sensations, and the mystery of wakefulness that illumines them all. Here, and then gone in a flash. And the extraordinary paradox is that this which is ever changing is at the same time changeless. A bird, a tear, a star, all the movement of a single life, one ocean dancing as 1,000 different waves, and yet always remaining itself. Okay, a picture is worth 1,000 words, as the old saying goes, so I'm going to show you, actually not a picture, but a little video, and do a little guided exploration with you around the theme of what you're going to see here in a moment. Show that. This is what I was just writing about in that little passage. Life, the ocean of life, is giving rise to these countless and ceaseless waves of phenomena of experience, all the different forms that life can take. And those are the waves that are rising up and falling back down and rising up and falling back down. And this very much feels like a kind of tidal movement of existence, of life, of our experience. And our tendency is to focus on all the ways that the waves appear to be distinct from one another, and that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But we, as I often say, we tend to be engaged in this process of sort of trying to locate the waves of phenomena, the waves of experience that we categorize as the good ones, the ones we like, the ones we imagine represent whatever it is we're aspiring to have more of in life: happiness, well-being, freedom, joy. And then those other waves, those other phenomena that we equate with a lack of well-being, a lack of joy, a lack of happiness, a lack of freedom. This is the way we split the world up into seeming distinctions and differentiations. And from one perspective, um, yes, everything is utterly distinct and unique and different. Every little taste and every little flavor, every little wave of experience is different. This particular wave of experience right now is like none other. That's what's so extraordinary. But as this very simple footage of the ocean doing what it does, which is making waves, illustrates so beautifully, and our experience is constantly illustrating to us, if we make a little slight shift in how we're orienting to it, we can realize that yes, there is all this distinction and all this differentiation, all these seemingly different waves of phenomena and experience and people, places, and things. But all of it is of a singular nature. All of it is the rising up, the unfolding, the upwelling of the mystery, upwelling of life itself, of God. And so, from this perspective, there, and just as I say these words, as I speak what I'm speaking, just feel into your experience right now. This ever-changing, dynamic, fluid flow of, of life. And notice the way in which our experiences, which really is our world, our experiences, and that would include whatever we imagine the self to be, has no existence independent of this, of reality, independent of the ground of being itself. There's no separation between one thing and another, between one apparent phenomena and another. There's no gaps anywhere. There's just a continuum of life, a continuum of experiencing, a continuum of reality, of existence, this oceanic presence that's here right now, that's being felt, however it's being felt. The waves of experience rising up, but they, no matter how they may be appearing, they never depart from their basis, the basis of the fundamental absolute reality that everything is emerging from, whatever we might call that, because there really is no name for it. There's no name for it because it is all names. It is all things, all phenomena. Just as all waves are none other than the sea. They are inseparable from the sea. They are the sea's expression. So each one of us, as we may imagine ourselves as somehow separate and isolated, independently existing creatures, are none other than the vast ocean of reality itself. There's really actually no distinction. From one perspective, we look at the sea and there are no waves, actually. There's just a sea being a sea that's just moving and dancing and always becoming something and yet always simply being itself. And this is one of the reasons why, in some traditions, and certainly the way I um, teach about these things as well, there's no need to actually correct or alter or modify any aspect of your experience in order to get closer to the ground of being somehow, to get closer to divinity, to get closer to to this basic primal existence, because all of our experience is none other than that. So there's, from that perspective, at least, there's no hierarchy of experience. There's no closer or further from the ground. There's no type of wave that is more the sea than any other type of wave, because they are all the expression of the sea. So every thought, every feeling, every sensation, every memory, every wondering, a chaotic mind or a still mind, tension, relaxation, all these different ways we might describe what's here experientially. From this perspective, they are all of the same nature. They are all of the same basic. I don't know what to call it. Basic reality. Sometimes I just call it this that's here. Whatever this is, there's no possibility of capturing it in any word or concept, because it's too fathomless, it's too infinite. And this that's always here, this presence of reality, looks like whatever it looks like in the instant, feels however it feels in the instant. But it's not dependent on how it looks any more than the ocean is dependent on how the waves may be appearing. The sea remains the sea, whether it's calm or stormy. And this is what we are. This is what everything is. We're made of this. Everything is made of this. Yes, there's certain states we could say we prefer over others in terms of our particular preferences. But what I'm pointing to here is the equalness of all experience, of all phenomena, equal in its vitality, equal in its radiance, equal in its unfathomable, ungraspable, infinite nature. All of it the shining forth of the mystery, all of it. And we don't have to do something to make the shining forth happen, because the shining forth is the nature of everything. So there's no effort required. What we think of as ourselves is the shining forth, as is everything else. Somehow, inexplicably, reality is shining forth, radiating this magnificence, this astonishing intelligence and vitality and so the Buddhists say that phenomena have no independent existence. This is the concept of emptiness in Buddhism. And if we just put it in ordinary language, we would say that what we look at and perceive and describe as a wave is none other than the sea. That's just how the sea looks at that particular point. But you're always looking at the sea. So there's a thought, and that's what reality looks like right there at that point. That's what God looks like right there. A feeling arises, oh, that's what reality looks like. That's what the mystery looks like right there. So you're always looking at the only thing you could ever be looking at, which is this unfathomable divinity. Well, that's probably a nice launching pad. If anyone would like to speak about any of this, I'm happy to explore with you as always. It's a funny thing because the world seems to show up as pieces and as parts, doesn't it? You know, you look in the visual field and it looks like there's these parts. You know, I'm in my room and I see these objects that I call objects, and they look like pieces, separate pieces. But visual field's a great analogy for this because, and it is about perspectives, as I often say, because from one perspective, oh sure, there's all these separate pieces showing up in my room here, my studio. But the visual field is a complete whole. There's no pieces to the visual field. It's a field of vision. There's no gaps anywhere. There's no actual parts in the visual field. It's like a painting, you know, it looks like all these objects in the painting, doesn't it? You know, there's that, the cathedral in the painting, or there's that person in the painting, but there's no actual separate objects in the painting, are there? So the visual field is a beautiful illustration of the wholeness of reality. There's no pieces, there's no parts, actually. Even though it shows up as pieces and parts, as seemingly separate things. Just like the ocean shows up as seemingly separate waves, but it's a whole, isn't it? It's a complete whole. This is wholeness. This is, you know, it's no surprise that the word healing comes from the whole, from wholeness, because touching and recognizing this seamlessness, this wholeness that is everything, there are no pieces and parts, feels nourishing. It is nourishing. It's the constant, ceaseless nourishment of life itself. And it never, the spigot is never turned off, which is so astonishing. He never shuts off. It's just on. Life is on. There's no turning it off. No matter what's happening, the world could just be completely falling apart, and the light switch of this nourishing, sustaining, inexplicable energy is never switched off. It's always on, illuminating everything, shining forth as everything, being everything, radiating as everything. And it's just amazing. It's just amazing. Radiating as each one of us. So we imagine ourselves these separate, isolated creatures somehow in relationship to a vast, larger world. But, and again, it can feel that way from one vantage, from the perspective of the seeming separate individual wave, like that we imagine ourselves to be. But go back to that video, and that's just one perspective, because everything about our nature is made of whatever it is that we are made of, which is, so are we really separate waves, or are we the sea? In a sense, we're both simultaneously somehow. But we have a tendency, I tend to emphasize the oceanic perspective because we're operating as human creatures primarily from that other perspective and imagining ourselves as vulnerable subjects in a vast, potentially dangerous world. But that is just one perspective. We are literally the world. And from that perspective, there's actually not vulnerability. We're not the victims of life. We are life. We're not the victims of life. That's a very different perspective. Sometimes if you take something like thoughts and feelings, which humans often feel like we're somehow at the mercy of these things and we have to do something about them and they're overwhelming or confusing or, it's like, but there's a completely different way to flip. You could flip that around and see that everything that's being experienced that we call thoughts and feelings are simply an expression of what you are. There's no threat. They're just, in the same way that my voice is an expression of me, our thoughts and feelings are just like, just things that are being given birth, from, you could say, from us. And how are they a threat? They're not a threat. They're just an expression of us. They might not be comfortable. We might say they're not comfortable, but it's such a different vantage to feel that, to recognize that right here, you're just sitting here and everything that's occurring is simply an expression of you. There's no subject object. There's just experiencing, expressing itself as all of this unthinkable complexity and amazingness and indescribable. There's no words.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
So,
hey, Chris.
Hi. So that's experiencing no threat, feelings, thoughts, sensations, perceptions, until there comes this subtle judgment sometimes that says this shouldn't be happening. I shouldn't be behaving this way. I shouldn't be feeling this. It's, so it seems like, that's kind of where the suffering can really, or the pain or the stress can take hold. This shouldn't be happening.
Right. Yeah. Right. And a couple of things. One is that the judgments are just more thoughts, right? More thinking. And so one way you can, work with that, if you will, it's not really work, but just to notice that what you're calling judgments is just more that's being expressed. It's yet another thing that you don't actually have to do something about. It's just something that's just appearing. One of the things about trying to do something about our experience in order to feel better, which is sort of the human condition a lot of the time, right? If I can just get this damn experience and my circumstances to line up in the way that I'd like it to line up, right? Call it the micromanaging of our experience. It's like the effort to do something about what's appearing experientially, it has the effect of reinforcing the idea that what's appearing is a problem, number one, right? Because we have to do something about it. So right away, we're kind of conditioning ourselves to imagine, well, actually, it really is a problem. We're in that loop of imagining that these phenomena are problematic. But the other thing is that if you come back to the ocean and the wave analogy, that this idea, this seeing from this perspective that experiential phenomena don't have independent existence, awakens us to a discovery that from that vantage, there are no things. So there's not actually something here to do something about experientially. And that really changes things because it just completely undercuts the notion that there's something that has to be managed. I mean, it's a radical notion. It's very counter to how we've been trained up, you know, as humans. For some reason, we just took a little turn this way and imagined that there was something wrong about us, something wrong about our experience that had to be fixed. And that, you could say, that's kind of a hypothesis we sort of operate from a lot of the time, right? And I'm just inviting another possibility, that what if that wasn't true? What if nothing was broken about any of this at all?
So in your experience, have there been over the years, just a clear, experiencing just clear seeing and knowing of that, it's just so evident and so obvious, of that everything's constantly moving, nothing, there are no things, it just
Right.
all falls away. And then, if it's sometime in the, later, it's almost as if that's completely forgot and
seems to be forgotten. Yeah.
To be forgotten, and there's intense pain,
right,
confusion.
I think it's a kind of just a habit of how we're orienting to experience, you know. It's sort of like which perspective we're orienting from, in a way. Because we could say that there is a perspective where things seem to have a certain independent existence and can be problematic, and then we operate from within that. And from within that frame of reference, it's true, you could say, right? So I'm inviting kind of developing a new orientation, or another way of orienting to experience. And the other thing I would say about that is that anytime that you explore experience, and I know you've checked out some of my work, so when you could enter into experience and discover that it's not definable, okay, that's true even when it's difficult. So even when you might be describing it as a moment of losing sight of what I'm talking about, like losing sight of that plot and falling into some imagination of there's something missing, there's something lacking, there's something wrong about me or my experience, I've got to fix that, right? That whole narrative. So what's really interesting is that entire narrative is also yet another indefinable, ungraspable phenomena. So ordinarily, the way we kind of think in these kinds of spiritual sort of conversations is that, oh, well, I have this recognition of the wholeness, the seamless reality, that there aren't things, there's just this seamless reality shining forth as everything, and we can sense how amazing that is to behold that, to recognize that, the power of it, the presence of it, the liberating nature of that. And then it can feel, like you were saying, as if we've lost contact with that somehow, right? And so then we set about to recontact it, to re-recognize it. Fair enough. And that can be a process that we're kind of going back and forth. And it seems like we're going back and forth. But what's really interesting, I'll go back to the ocean metaphor again. If I put it in those terms, it's like, oh, there's a recognition of the vast, boundless, seamless, fathomless sea. And then there's those waves that reappear, and we feel like we're caught in the waves, and got to get back to the ocean. Do you see how funny that is? You never left the ocean, even when you went back to the waves. Even when we feel quite human and vulnerable, and the narratives are spinning seemingly out of control, and we seem lost, and we want to find the ocean again. It's like, so the practice is to recognize, I would say, rather than how do I find my way back to the ocean, simply recognize that there is no leaving the ocean ever, no matter what, under any circumstance, because all there is the ocean. So it can't be left. And the kind of one of the pragmatic effects of that, you could say, for a human, is that A, it just feels way better, just in very simple terms. But also it undercuts that whole idea, again, that something is wrong. So even interpreting and narratives, there's nothing, interpretation and narrative isn't really interpretation and narrative. It's also uninterpreted, infinite mystery. That can show up like interpretation and narrative, to be sure, and does almost all the time. I think what happens is we have a tendency to equate, we can get this kind of feeling of contrast when, maybe we're listening to what I'm speaking about, for example, and then there's a sense of kind of recontacting that in a way, or being re-reminded of that. And there's a sense of it could be a sense of like, oh, wow, it's like, yeah, back home again, and how amazing that feels to feel like reconnected with the boundlessness of this and the undivided nature of this and the ever-present nature of it, right? And then so then we have this kind of contrast with this, from this sense of maybe more contraction and sense of separation to that sense of open, boundless freedom. And it feels like a nice contrast, right? So then we find ourselves back in the throes of life, and it may feel like contracted again. And so there's this, so we're tending to equate our contact with reality with how we're feeling, basically. And that's the mistake. Because reality doesn't feel one way, it feels every way. It feels like heartbreak sometimes. It feels like sadness sometimes. It feels like confusion sometimes. And it feels like bliss and open-heartedness and other times too. So the presence of what's here doesn't depend upon how it's looking. I think maybe we were talking about this last week, about how, or sometime I was using the analogy of the reality being like a TV program, and we might have preferences to watch certain kinds of shows on the TV of life. Like I like rom-coms and I don't like sci-fi or horror movies or whatever, whatever our preferences are. And but the TV of reality is still the program of reality is still the program of reality, no matter what's showing on the screen. No matter how the light is configuring itself as a horror show or as a wonderful moment in nature, it's still the light show. It's still the light show. And so it doesn't depend, I would say the way I would put this is that freedom doesn't depend on how it's looking. It looks like everything. That's how free it is. It's free to look like anything and everything. And that's the presence of, you could say, the beingness of the moment, the beingness of the presence, the isness, the suchness, the beingness of this moment. You feel it. You feel the presence of this moment, right? No matter how you're describing this moment, it is, right? If you feel sad, if you feel happy, if you feel clear, if you feel confused, it still is. It still exists. That's its primal beingness, its presence. And the presence does not depend on how it's looking and how it's being described. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah.
And yeah, we have preferences. I have preferences. I like it to look certain ways. Mm-hmm. that I find more in alignment with what I value and what I love. But sometimes it doesn't look that way. And if it's not looking the way I might like it to look or prefer it to look the moment, it doesn't mean that anything has actually changed in terms of what's actually here fundamentally. Mm-hmm. It's still the ocean no matter how it's waving.
Yeah.
That's that to wear out that metaphor. But these days it seems to be there's no wearing out of that metaphor for me, because I just find it to be such a powerful one. It really illustrates that in such a simple, I mean, just look at it the next time you can look at it, or watch a video if you're not near the sea, and just watch the ocean do what it does, which is make waves. And see that, look and say, it's like, are there really waves? Or is there just ocean?
Mm.
The waves never, one of my songs I sing that no wave could ever be apart from the ocean. Nothing arising escapes the sea. So it can never leave, like we can never leave the totality, because that's what we are. The wave can't leave the ocean. It's simply the ocean's expression. So the waves of our experience are never actually something that needs to be corrected. We still can choose to change our experiences and circumstances. That's to whatever extent we find ourselves able to. We can do that, and that's fine to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. For sure, there's nothing wrong with that. But this is like accessing like another, it's like accessing another domain of well-being, another realm of well-being that's not conditional. I mean, if I feel healthy like I do right this moment, you know, in terms of my bodily health, we could say, well, that's well-being. And then if I get really sick or something, then I would say that's like an absence of well-being. That's within the realm of how the waves are being described, right? But what I'm talking about is this other domain, this other realm of well-being that's not conditional. It's the well of being, as I say, of being itself. That's well, even when it's not well.
Mm-hmm.
It's well because its nature is well, its nature is beyond description, but
I found the
hi, Diana.
hi. I found the ocean metaphor really helpful. And what came to mind for me is just very current as you were talking about waves, because you know, in the US here, we've had so many conversations about blue waves and red waves this week. And so that's what came to mind for me as you were talking about these waves keep coming, and how kind of our national conversations have been around what wave is coming. Is it going to be blue? Is it going to be red? The waves that we want to be coming towards us.
And some want blue and some want red.
Right, yeah. And I mean, so that's kind of where my mind drifted. And but what I loved about that is again, here's where my mind went, is that just as each wave is really part of the ocean, it suddenly made me think, well, each of these political leanings are all part of America. And depending on where we stand or how we think about each wave that's coming in, and we're quick as human beings to say, well, I like this wave, but I don't like that wave.
That's right.
Right, feel comfortable with this one, I'd prefer this one. But they're all expressions of America. Right,
and yeah, and from that perspective, it's a great, almost sort of like an analogy on top of an analogy in terms of you could say, you know, how we arrange ourselves as societies and cultures and people as humans. We touched a little bit upon this, I think, last week, but how our language, our categorizing of things tends to create the sense of division, basically. And there's an in-group and an out-group based on whatever it is we're identifying with, whether it's ideology or religion, or race or gender or political party. But what you're pointing to is that that's from the perspective of the different waves. And yes, there's kind of, if you identify with a wave that's a blue wave or a red wave, to use that example, you've got, almost by definition, there's an in-group and an out-group. Like, hey, you're either a red wave or a blue wave. I mean, even that distinction itself is so crazy, because we talked about this last week, that it's like within those categories, we oversimplify it and say, oh, those are the blue wave people or those are the red wave people, when in those categories there's such diversity. In fact, there's infinite diversity. So from that perspective, you can't even create those categories. They're misleading, which is really amazing.
Right.
But,
like looking at the ocean, you can't, I mean, as soon as you identify, oh, there's a wave,
right,
it can break into so many other waves.
Exactly.
Or disappear, right?
Exactly.
Right before your eyes. And
yeah,
just something about that just really brought me a sense of peace around this whole process and our whole conversation around this.
What if there was no in-group and out-group? What would that be like? That's kind of what I feel you suggesting in that.
Well, yeah, that, and for me personally, it makes me feel more comfortable with all of the different kinds of waves.
With all the diversity, yeah.
Right, that are expressing itself as America.
Yeah.
And that some of those waves are not going to feel good, and that some of those waves are going to feel good. And
yeah, depending on how you orient to things, right? I mean, half of the population is, unhappy with the outcome, the apparent outcome.
Of America, an African American's experience or expression or wave of expression of America is going to be different than a white person's wave.
But what's really amazing is that owing to the uniqueness of every wave, like even though two waves may look similar, and we'll put them in the same category. Oh, those are the ferocious waves, or those are the calm, quiet, barely perceptible waves, right? Each wave is entirely distinct and unique. Like there is no wave like Diana anywhere, right? Or Chris or any of us. So I was saying in another conversation on Zoom that when we recognize the utter complete uniqueness of every sort of form that life can assume, from that perspective, we can't categorize, actually. And that undercuts, from my perspective, a lot of what I might describe as the craziness of the world. Because it's like there's actually no categories. Wow. We can assume identities, and we do as humans, where we identify with a certain category or way that we're defining ourselves, right? But those are just oversimplifications, because what we are, because there's no, this is really wild. There's like, because of our complete uniqueness, there's no reference point in a way to even know what we are, because there's not something to compare it to. And if I start comparing you to something else that's my reference point to kind of know what Diana is, I'm off in fantasy land, because you're not like that. Even if there's similarity, say with you, with another woman, so I put you in the category of women, it's like, that's a reference point. But it's a complete oversimplification of what you are, because yes, you may share certain characteristics, but as a friend of mine likes to say, who teaches kind of the same stuff, he says, a little bit different is a euphemism for completely different, actually. And someone was saying when we were having this conversation the other time about, well, that could be kind of like a lonely thing, like you belong in no category because you're entirely unique. But from another perspective, you belong in all groups because of that uniqueness, because you're not in any single group. And that's the all-inclusive nature of it. And the ocean, it's like everyone is the ocean, and that's the unifying principle of all of this, in a sense, that we are all of the same stuff. We are all made of the same stuff fundamentally. Of course we are, despite the apparent differences. But boy, we tend to lose sight of that one, don't we? Quite often. Quite often. Yeah, I love that. Red waves, blue waves, but really just waves. Really just ocean. Really. Which isn't to deny, this is the interesting thing, it's like it's both, it's like the fact of this sameness, this common denominator of everything, the aliveness of everything, the oceanic reality of everything, doesn't exclude all the difference and all the differentiation and diversity. Clearly, I mean, everywhere you look, you see diversity of color, of type, of shape, of form, I mean, it's unbelievable, isn't it? All this diversity shining forth from a singularity. That's an amazing thing. That's an amazing thing. Amazes me, at least. Yeah. Always different and yet always itself. That's what I have to say. It's an amazing thing I was reflecting on this morning of like, and I say this a lot in my writings and work, it's like, what is the substance of things? Like, what is this made of? What is existence made of? What are your thoughts made of? We think of these thoughts as these like things that are somehow like driving me crazy, my thoughts. It's like, well, what are they? What are they made of? Like, what is the basis of them? Like I mean, that's just an astonishing question. And it's true of you could ask that of anything. What is the basis of anything? What is this moment? What's the basis of this moment? What's this moment? What is this moment of experiencing arising out of? What is its basis? What is its source?
John?
Hey, Michael.
Good morning. Great to hear you. So, from the point of view of this oceanic perspective,
Mm-hmm.
where everything is perfectly as it is,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all just the display, the activity, the creative intelligence of life.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no problem. There's no conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I sometimes have a sense of that,
Mm-hmm.
and experiencing that right now in your company is very, very nice. And then hearing about all this discord, without naming any names, about politicians or leaders who don't seem to be coming from a place of clarity or wisdom or benevolence. So this is a classic question, I guess, or consideration. From one point of view, everything is perfect. It's just the ocean, and no matter how gnarly, how ugly, how harsh the appearance, it's only an appearance, so it's not ultimately a problem. And at the same time, there is we call evil or negativity or ignorance that causes division and pain and problems. So traditionally, it would be said, or one response to that would be, if one is called to act in the world, whatever way that would express, then that just happens, and if not, it doesn't happen. But I'm sure you can sense my question, or
Sure.
but,
I was just actually having a conversation with our friend Peter the other day about this, and it came up with, there were a few other people present, and we were talking about how one way to understand, I think, your question is to think of life, or to kind of look at life from as occurring across a spectrum of perspectives, just like the rainbow shows up in a spectrum of color, right?
yes,
So depending on where we find ourselves in the spectrum of sort of, I don't know how to put this exactly, but it's for me, it's like a perspectival spectrum. And so from one perspective, and there's a good analogy for this, looking at the material world, the so-called material world too. Like from one perspective, what I'm speaking on looks like an object appearing in space that I would call a computer. So that's one place on the spectrum of what that is from a certain perspective. But if I look at it from another perspective, I explore its nature and I delve into what the computer is made of. I start to discover, oh well, it's composed of these various parts, isn't it? And so now I've opened up like another part of the spectrum of what it is. It doesn't exclude the other perspective. It's just I'm opening up another dimension to it, right? I'm another part of the spectrum of what it is. And so we could do that with the material world, and we could go all the way down to the subtlest things that we understand about the material world, and we're left with God knows what, empty space. But even that's saying too much about what it is, right? It's like a potentiality for something to come into existence. It's as if it's like not even there. It's so subtle, right? So, well, that's a really different perspective than, this hard, what I would call hard surface of an object called the computer, right? So which is it? Is it the computer, or is it ungraspable space, materially speaking? Well, we could say it's all of the above, or in a sense none of the above, because it transcends all of it, in a sense, from the maybe the most refined perspective of what it is. So I think we could take world events, and we could do the exact same thing. We could look at some person who's acting in a particular way, who's in a position of leadership, let's say, or how people reacting to that person, or the whole thing. I mean, and we could describe it in the ways we often describe it as humans. What this person is doing is divisive, let's say, harmful, and maybe then we might feel moved to try to do something about that, or maybe we're just going to be worried about it, or react to it with anger, or who knows what our response to it might be. Or maybe we feel kind of indifference to it because we feel like there isn't anything we can really do about it, and all these different reactions we could have. And all of that I'm describing now is like that level of the spectrum of how it appears to be based on sort of conventional descriptions of it, right? And all I'm really talking about is, without invalidating those perspectives, because I think everything's included. I mean, that's a real idea of non-duality, is that it's all inclusive of everything. Nothing is left out of its reach. It can show up and look like and appear as, well, all that it can look like and show up and appear as. But from another perspective, take your favorite politician, let's say, who you might not like. Maybe it's Biden, maybe it's Trump, it depends where one falls along, political ideology, to take those two politicians who are in our consciousness right now. And either one, well, what are they? What do they believe? What do they think? What are their personalities like? And we could describe them, and then we could delve deeper into what is their deepest nature. What are they made of? And they are none other than they are the absolute reality itself, that's showing up like that. Now, we could say that maybe the reason it's showing up in the ways that we might describe as harmful or divisive is a function of what it looks like when reality misses itself, when it doesn't recognize itself, when it, what I mean? Exactly. And then, I mean, to me, it makes complete logical sense resonates with me, because when we miss ourselves with a capital S, when we miss what we are, when we miss the all-fulfilling, all-nourishing nature of life itself, the ocean, then we act in any number of ways to try to fill the void, that we misperceive to be here.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be relatively benign. We try to have fulfilling relationships to fill the void. That might be relatively benign, but we might, seek power and prestige and abuse people, and all of it can be understood as a kind of effort to, what does the Dalai Lama say? Everybody's looking for happiness.
Right. That's right.
The people that flew planes into the Twin Towers, in 2001, were looking for happiness.
That's right. That's right.
And they just, when reality reality misses itself, which, is one of its modes, is to miss itself, to not see itself, to not recognize itself, to imagine that it's not here, then it will go on a search for it. And that search can take any number of forms. Again, some relatively benign looking and some not so benign looking, right?
Yeah. John, one more thought about that very quickly.
Please, yeah.
So, watching the whole process of the election and watching all the debates and there's all the back and forth, and it really, this has occurred to me before. It's much more vivid now, that someone who's coming from a place of or perspective of ignorance, of fear, of aggression, and then all the corresponding ways of thinking that would come from that. You can't negotiate with it. You can't convince that person that they're missing something. So and the polarization that's occurred now, say between the conservatives and the progressives, it's like people either see something or they don't.
No question about it that as humans, and this holds true for anyone of any ideological, religious, political persuasion, we can start to believe that our interpretations are true about this, and our viewpoints are not just viewpoints, but are actually equivalent to reality. And the more we believe that to be the case, and the more sort of dogmatically invested in those viewpoints we are, then yes, the less open we're going to be to consider the possibility that that might not be true, and that there might be another perspective, that there might be another. And this to me is also one of the pragmatic implications of what I'm teaching, which is that the more we recognize that reality can't be subsumed in our frames of reference, not without losing its depth and richness and multidimensional complex nature, that are, in other words, our frameworks are oversimplifying what's here, terribly so. And when that's seen, we realize the frames of reference are partial at best. They're potentially useful maps, but they are not the territory, right? And I think one of the pragmatic implications of that is it is a lot harder to hold your viewpoints very rigidly, because why would you do that when they're partial at best? It's like they're not the final truth. And I think that has huge implications for how people relate to one another, how they resolve conflicts, how they are able to problem solve less and less from a rigidly held perspective about how to address a problem, but it opens up creativity, because now you're not locked into one point of view, because you recognize this is beyond points of view. So I think that that's just a huge kind of side, not just a side benefit, but like a direct benefit of recognizing that this is beyond perspective, that this is reality is fundamentally beyond perspective. But clearly we live in a world where it would seem most humans are walking around believing that their perspectives are the truth. And I don't think that that's unique to any one political party, personally, if you want to talk politics. Far from it.
Yeah, that sort of tribal tendency to identify with one's group.
Big.
Yeah.
It's big. And and the kind of inquiries that I'm inviting really cut through that. They can
Yes.
really cut through that tendency to see the world that way, in those kinds of definitional categorical terms where there's a this and a that, and a me and a they, and a in group out group, and
Yeah.
it's just absolutely, like, it depends from one part of that spectrum of perspectives. That's true, like, you're not me. But when I kind of go down down into the bottomless nature of what I call you and me, I discover that that's not the whole story. There's
Right.
another
Right.
story there, and it's a story
Right.
of indivisibility, and of just a sea of experiencing that's here, that's showing up as otherness, that's showing up as relationship between apparent
Okay.
others, but
Okay.
is fundamentally transcends self and other.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Michael.
much.
Yeah, always nice to chat with you, always. This is the very first book I ever wrote about this stuff is called Too Intimate for Words, and I opened up to this, and it was perfect because to the earlier conversation we are having about the ocean wave metaphor. So I thought I'd read this to you. It's called "The Barrier is Also God." Think for a moment of anything you perceive as an obstacle to your own realization. Mental restlessness, conditioning, fear, desire, self-contraction, resistance. I imagine the list is fairly long. But if the ultimate truth is that there is only one, not two, then all these apparent obstacles must, in fact, be manifestations of the very same one you believe these are keeping you from seeing and knowing. In other words, if the walls are made of the very thing you are seeking, then there really are no walls. Maybe these apparent obstacles are none other than the very thing that you long to touch. Whether you appear to be lost in the frothy waves of life or submerged in the still depths below, wake up and realize that you can never be apart from the sea. So the so-called agitated mind is the movement of the sea, just as a still mind is the movement of the sea. Just like a churned up ocean body of water is the ocean as much as a calm sea. just different versions of it, different versions of the same fundamental reality. It can seem like certain states of mind, certain experiences, circumstances are somehow departing from the sea, leaving the ground. But the sea is always the sea. Can't actually lose itself because it is itself. It's the only thing that exists. Can't lose itself. It just is itself. And it is your very being. What you would feel as your own being is none other than that, the beingness of life. I mean, at what point does, if you feel into what you imagine as your own being, at what point do you reach the end of your own being and arrive at the beingness of the world? Is there actually like a gap there where you end and then the world begins? Or is it a continuum of being? And the beautiful thing is that this is, we always have this because this is what is here to have. This is what is here, is the beingness of the moment. It's just we don't have to do something to switch it on, to get it going, get the beingness of the moment going, so I can feel it. I got to do something to, so I can feel the beingness of the moment is here, long before we ever try to make it be here, or recognize it, or feel it. It's being felt as this moment. Always, 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 always being felt as the moment. Feels like it might be a nice place to end on. So enjoy your rest of your days. Wonderful to be with all of you as always. And thanks for being here, and hope to see you another time.
Thank you, John.
Oh,
Thanks.
thank you so much.